Bueno, muchísimas gracias a todos, gracias por la espera. Bienvenidos a esta conferencia, Experiencias de Transferencia Social del Conocimiento en Comunidades Rurales. Esta es una conferencia que organizamos junto a la Universidad UDCA, quienes nos han acompañado en esta oportunidad organizando una nueva jornada del Tour de la Transferencia Social Fulbright Rumbo. Hemos venido desde hace 2 semanas trabajando con nuestras universidades miembros, con las universidades de Rumbo, para ofrecerles a nuestras universidades precisamente una serie de actividades con la experta de Fulbright, Tasha Howe, quien ha brindado muchas lecciones, enseñanzas y aprendizajes frente a lo que ha sido su carrera como investigadora, frente a su área temática y cada una de sus aprendizajes que nos pueden servir a cada uno de nosotros en las áreas de conocimiento en las que nos desempeñemos o según la etapa en la carrera investigativa en la que se encuentre cada uno en su institución. Los que se encuentran acá en Zoom, les damos la bienvenida. Gracias a todos los que le han puesto interés a esta actividad. Vamos a darles un par de instrucciones a ustedes, a los de Zoom primero, para que tengan en cuenta. La charla de Tasha va a estar principalmente en el idioma inglés y ustedes pueden seleccionar una traducción simultánea a través de un icono que dice interpretación acá en el Zoom. Ustedes en cualquier momento pueden hacer el switch al audio en español a través de ese icono y podrán escuchar la traducción simultánea que es posible gracias a nuestra traductora Claudia, quien ha estado acompañándonos también durante todos estos eventos, en todos estos eventos traduciendo al español para cada una de las personas de nuestro público y que nadie se pierda un solo mensaje de lo que tiene que decirnos Tasha, ¿vale? Entonces, como les decía, vayan a la sección de interpretación y ahí pueden seleccionar la opción español. En este momento no se está escuchando nada porque pues no hay nadie hablando en inglés y por tanto pues no hay traducción disponible, pero tan pronto Tasha empieza a hablar en inglés, ahí podrán encontrar la traducción. La segunda indicación es que para todos ustedes que también acá se encuentran en el Zoom, les recomendamos que utilicen la sección preguntas y respuestas para enviarnos sus preguntas a lo largo de la charla. Con eso a nosotros se nos facilita muchísimo más organizar las preguntas para que las podamos compartir al final de la charla. Para los que se encuentran en YouTube, ustedes pueden enviarnos sus preguntas a través del chat para que nosotros podamos hacérselas a Tasha al final del evento. Y si ustedes también pues, quieren acceder a la traducción simultánea, les pondremos el enlace de Zoom para que se puedan conectar también acá. ¿Listo? Tercera y última indicación, que tengan presente que esta es realmente una actividad muy interactiva donde necesitamos que ustedes estén súper presentes para que podamos hacer de esto una conversación y que no sea simplemente pues que Tasha nos cuente su charla que tienen preparada, sino que también ustedes también se involucren en esta conversación. Como les decía, lo pueden hacer a través de Zoom, a través de YouTube, pero también a través de nuestras redes sociales, donde hemos estado colgando cada una de nuestras actividades, actualizando cada una de las partes que ha tenido este tour de la transferencia social, usando el hashtag Tour de Transferencia Social Rumbo. Aquí encuentran nuestras redes, nuestra página de internet también www.rumbo.edu.co, donde pueden encontrar también lo que nos queda de este tour que ya finaliza esta semana. ¿Listo? Nuevamente darles la bienvenida pues a esta conferencia que hemos llamado Experiencias de Transferencia Social del Conocimiento en Comunidades Rurales. Y ahora pues le voy a dar paso a Johan Cifuentes, que nos acompaña de la UTE y nos va a contar un poco como cuáles son las expectativas que tiene la universidad para esta actividad. Muchas gracias a todos nuevamente y los dejo con Johan.
Hola Pablo, muchas gracias. Tasha, un saludo. Muchas gracias a todos por su participación. Bueno, en este espacio nos encontramos en su mayoría profesores de la Universidad de Ciencias Aplicadas y Ambientales. También veo que hay algunas conexiones de investigadores externos. La Universidad de Ciencias Aplicadas y Ambientales orienta sus actividades en su mayoría hacia el desarrollo sostenible y al abordaje de las problemáticas sociales desde la inter y transdisciplinariedad, fomentando y desarrollando de esta manera acciones tendientes a la inclusión social y al fortalecimiento de los lazos entre los diferentes actores de desarrollo. Esperamos que en este espacio podamos conocer todas las herramientas y todo lo que es necesario para poder transferir el conocimiento que se genera a partir de las actividades de investigación a las comunidades y en específicas a las comunidades rurales. Es una de nuestras, eh, es uno de nuestros actores o nuestros énfasis en cuanto a nuestras actividades. Pues agradecemos a todos y participación y ya le daría espacio. Gracias.
Vale, muchas gracias, Johan. Bueno, voy a presentarles ahora a Tasha, que es nuestra protagonista pues, de esta actividad y de todo nuestro tour de la transferencia social. Ella va a ser la encargada también de darnos la charla que nos reúne en este momento. Tasha es PhD, es profesora del Departamento de Psicología de Humboldt State University en Arcata, California, en Estados Unidos. Ella es psicóloga de desarrollo que se especializa en la prevención del abuso infantil y psicopatología. Es entrenadora principal del programa para padres de prevención del abuso infantil de la Asociación Americana de Psicología, Raising Safe Kids. Su último proyecto es la segunda edición de su libro del texto Marriages and Families in the 21st Century, a Bioecological Approach. Ha trabajado en temas internacionales de bienestar infantil como becaria Fulbright en 3 ocasiones, en 2008 en Chipre, 2014 en Croacia y 2017 en Rusia. A menudo trabaja en el desarrollo y la evaluación de programas, así como en la capacitación de profesionales de primera línea en temas como la neurociencia del trauma y cómo implementar prácticas basadas en evidencia con familias y niños. So, Tasha, thank you once again for joining us in this activity. Thank you for all the hard work you're bringing to this event with Rumbo. And well, it's your turn to give us your lecture. So thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a todos. Bienvenidos. Thank you to Rumbo and Fulbright for inviting me here. My university is also in a very rural area. We're the only university for a 5-hour drive in any direction. So we are very isolated. We are surrounded by 13 Native American tribes, and I've done a lot of work in different rural contexts. And so hopefully there will be something useful for you today. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see this?
Yeah, Tasha, we can see it.
All right. What's interesting about wanting to work in rural communities is that rural communities are how universities began. I feel like I'm going to sneeze. So if I sneeze in a few minutes, don't be alarmed. Okay. So the original universities were developed by religious groups, and most of these universities were set on top of mountains or in very beautiful isolated settings. And so they put these universities right in the middle of rural areas, but they were not interested at all in integrating the local community with the university. So their idea was that the local communities were corrupt, maybe savage, primitive. And so students who were going to these universities were living on campus, provided all of their food and everything they needed to protect them from becoming part of that savage community. In terms of the United States, in 1862, they began the program of land grant universities, where each state was given 30,000 acres of federal land to build a university. But if you were going to receive this land, you had to provide service to the public. So universities begrudgingly did this. They felt obligated to do it, but they were not happy about it. And today, the same is still true. Many universities do not feel like the people in the surrounding communities or in the rural communities are of the same caliber that they are, or are of the same worth that the elite at the universities are. In the United States today, 90% of universities have an Office of Community Engagement. So this issue is very important to everyone. However, only 1/3 actually have people from surrounding communities working there. So it's still people from the top, from the elite, looking down at the communities. And notoriously, these offices of community engagement have very little funding. It's usually a staff of 1 or 2 people running 1,000 different programs. There's high turnover rates. And so once someone makes connections with rural communities, that person leaves and then the program dies. So this is kind of a never-ending cycle. The other problem is that many universities still have a colonialist mindset. So they're still sending students or volunteers or interns out into help those people who are considered to be different or less than the people at the university. And professors are designing research projects that fulfill their own destiny, but are not necessarily helping to enhance the assets of the community. So this is the typical pattern. The university does things to those people out in that community, and sometimes they ask that community for approval, and they might change a few things about their project, but very rarely is the arrow going in the other direction, where the project comes from the community and the university helps them to realize their vision. So I would encourage you to think about this one study that actually asked people in various communities near universities, how did they view the university? The #1 request they had is for universities to invite them to campus. Invite us to your arts events, to your academic lectures. Invite us to use your computer lab, your library. Invite us to be part of initiatives and programs and projects. So community wants to be part of the university, but they feel the university is not really reciprocating that desire. Their #3 request was to work together on mutually beneficial projects because they felt that the projects the universities do benefit the universities or the students or the faculty, but not necessarily the community. So after 6 months went by and universities started inviting these community members to events and to use campus resources, they found that the community members had a much more favorable impression of the university, and they felt that the university could be trusted because in the past, communities have felt that universities exploit them, that they use them to get what they can get. And so after inviting them and collaborating on projects with them, the community felt that the university was an asset to their community, and they felt the university wanted to enhance their community. So when you're conceptualizing your project, it's important to think about what would success look like and how can we measure our outcomes? I'll talk a little bit more about measurement later today. Who will the informants be? Who will tell us if our project is successful? Is it our data? Is it the people who live in the community? Who are these informants and what type of data will be collected? What are the short-term goals? But more importantly, what are the long-term goals? So what's going to happen when the project is over? Do we just leave all of the people in the community behind? What if the outcomes are not as you planned? What if things don't work out? What's your next step? So this is a good little diagram to show a successful way to plan your project. And the #1 blue square at the top says to consult the stakeholders. which means the people in the community. So you can't start planning without talking to the people about what they need, what they want, what would success look like for them? How do they want you to measure your outcomes? Do they want to partner with you? Can they implement part of the program? So it's very important that they are on board from the very beginning and that they're not just an afterthought after you've already designed your project. Then you go and say, hey, does this sound okay to you? And they say, yeah, okay. But they need to be an integral part of the project throughout the whole process. And they need to help you define the goals and objectives and work on the schedule. They need to take on some responsibilities and be a real partner for the project. And of course, you all know the different steps of deciding your budget and how you're tracking everything, but they need to be part of all of those steps of the project. So let's talk about some of the challenge of working in rural areas. First is isolation. Many of these communities do not trust outsiders, and that's rightly so, because they have been exploited. They have often been chased away from other areas and pushed into these areas. They lack trust. And so what are you going to do to make them feel that you're not exploiting them? They often lack transportation. So if you're going to do a project that requires them to be somewhere, you need to provide the transportation. A lot of times they are also a migratory population, so they tend to move around, especially if they are immigrant workers or farm workers who come for different seasons. It may be difficult to find people more than once. Also, rural areas feel the effects of climate change more than many other areas. So they may have degradation of their land, their water, their air. They may have had all kinds of groundwater pollution and other exploitations from mining companies, logging companies, and so forth. So they are experiencing the erosion of their areas. Many people also live in poverty and they lack infrastructure, whether it be roads, buildings, broadband, internet, technology, and so forth. So when you think about the challenges of doing your project, you need to be able to overcome these challenges by working with them and asking them, how would they like to approach the project? Many children in these areas are working and are not in school. So if your project is about children or adolescents, how are you going to work around that? Because they need to be earning their living and not spending time with you. Many of the adults also lack formal education, and they may not be able to read and write, even in their own language, indigenous language, or in Spanish. So what are you going to do with your measures? How are you going to determine how to measure your outcomes? They may have specific cultural, religious, or social beliefs that also do not match up with your goals. So if you're telling them your goal is to do a certain thing and they say that that does not fit with our cultural beliefs, you're going to have to figure out how to work around that and how to work with them and find a way that your project can be meaningful to them despite your differences. In terms of your measures, there's often a language problem because our measures use language that's developed in academic forums. So how do we know what words to use if we don't consult people from that community about those words? Because many words do not have a direct translation. So there may not be words for things like privacy or things like feelings or colors. So when you translate your measures into their language, you also have to translate them back, because once you translate them into their language, then they read it or they have someone read it to them and you translate it back into Spanish or whatever your language is, you might find that the back translation is not at all what you were aiming for. So it's very important to not just translate in one direction, but to back translate again to make sure that the nuances and the meaning is actually there in your measures. I'm going to talk a little bit about working with Indigenous people who are often living in these rural areas. It's very important that you have their elders and their community leaders buy into the project, because they are going to trust their elders more than they're going to trust you. That being said, just because one elder or one leader agrees doesn't mean the whole community agrees, because there may be different tribes or different groups that will need to be consulted as well. As I mentioned, we have 13 Native American tribes in my rural area, and they're not all the same, and they all have different beliefs, and they all have different leaders. So we try to consult as many of the tribes as we can when we're doing projects. Always respect their expertise. Instead of coming in with the colonialist mindset of, I'm going to help you people, think about how they can help you. They might have insights that you never thought about. It's very important that you get to know their culture, their religion, and their beliefs, because if you don't understand it, you're going to be judging it from a Western perspective. Involve them in all decisions, and that means from the very beginning, as I mentioned, step one is to work with them on a needs assessment. What do they need? What would help them? It might not be what you think they need. So one example from my work is that we were trying to do parenting classes to prevent child abuse. And when we met with the tribal leaders and we met with the education leaders, they were talking about how they needed a dentist. So we were thinking it would have never entered my mind that they need a dentist more than parenting support, because the parents are very stressed out. So we arranged to have a dentist come and do free services, and they agreed to do the parenting classes. So it was a win-win. Involve them in gaining expertise and implementing the program. So can you train them? Can you train community leaders to be leaders on the project, to be equal partners, to implement, to evaluate? If they have the buy-in and they're part of it, then they'll always have your back. They'll always be willing to help you. So I'll tell you a little bit about what I've done with our local tribe, the Hoopa Valley tribe. You can see the Hoopa Valley there is a very beautiful area, and this is where I live. And they are one of the 13 local tribes. And so a true partnership must include equity and inclusion, which means you have to include diverse people, not just the elders, the men, the leaders. You have to talk to old people, young people, women, men, and include everyone so that they know that the project is for everyone and it's not just going to benefit the powerful in their group either. You might even want to include some reparations for past wrongs. So we've done some reparations in our county. Particularly, we have an island that in 1860, the Native Americans were doing a ceremony for their religion, and white people came and killed all of them. They killed 301 hour. So then they took that island, and that island has been for white people ever since 1860. Well, over the past 10 years, our county has given more and more of that island back and cleaned up the toxic waste, cleaned up the pollution, the groundwater, the dumps of garbage. And now we've given the whole island back to the tribe. And now the tribe is using it again for their rituals. And so the other things that we do at our university is we do land acknowledgements. Anytime we have a concert or a lecture or any kind of event, we acknowledge that the land that we are on belonged to these tribes and that they did not give it up willingly. It's a small step to acknowledge what happened. The tribes, of course, would like us to give the land back I don't foresee that happening. So we have to do what little we can to acknowledge and work with the tribes to make reparations for the past. So it's very important to include their voices and their perspectives on your website or on any of your materials. Using data dashboards, showing graphs, showing progress over time in your project, and including them in the whole situation. You might need a formal memorandum of understanding if the project is about water or land or some kind of natural resources. You might need legal contracts. In my case, I'm just working in child abuse prevention. And so I met with the first PhD from this tribe, who is now a professor at our university. And I met with another PhD from another local tribe, and he's a clinical psychologist. So the three of us met and we designed the child abuse prevention program, where they would do the indigenous parts that integrate the rituals and the dances and the beliefs of the tribes. And then I would do the scientific parts with neuroscience and the research findings. And so we ended up doing 12 weeks of programming, and we reached every single one of the teachers of all the tribes, the administrators, secretaries, bus drivers, custodians. Everybody in the whole region was trained on child abuse prevention and violence prevention. And so we all considered it to be a very positive first step. So this is an example of participatory action research, where you're learning by collaborating with people who are trying to change a system that they are living in. So in my case, they are living in an area where there's a lot of family violence. There's a lot of violence against women and child abuse. So they want to change the system, but they don't want white lady to come in and tell them what to do. So we're collaborating on this. So this participatory rural appraisal by chambers consists of 5 steps. The first step is empowerment. Knowledge is shared by the locals. So we empower them to take charge of the project and own it. Respecting them means you're listening more than you're talking. So I can remember many meetings where my collaborators were just talking, and sometimes in their native language and sometimes in English, and I was listening. And then I was just waiting for them to feel like I needed to know something. Localization means using their local materials and resources to benefit them. So for example, in my area, they make a living off of salmon fishing. So if we can pay them for some of their salmon and use it in the dinners that we provide for the families, and we pay for that, anything that will benefit their community and their local skills. Enjoyment is a big part of it. It's a lot of work to do community-based research. It's more work than any kind of research there is. You're not just in a lab doing experiments. It's so much work, but it's also so much fun. You meet diverse people. You just get to learn so much about humanity that you never knew, and you get to make authentic relationships with people. Remember to be inclusive and not only deal with the elders or one group from that area. So now that you've designed your project, you've made your connections, the local community is buying into it, owning up to it, participating in it, how can you fund these projects? It's very difficult to get funding for community-based research. And so I have done my entire career of research with very little money. I have funding in quotes because I don't want you to think of funding only as money. It could be something else. So think about how you can build a coalition to implement your project across as many different disciplines as you can think of. So I have worked with all of these different disciplines, from school districts, indigenous groups, law enforcement. You know, I've gotten judges involved, I've worked with churches, even though nothing I do is religious. I've had a lot of interaction with churches who want to support what I do. And so they might provide food, they might provide spaces for meetings. You know, what can you do to build bridges, build a coalition? Because the more agencies you reach out across, the more chances you have of finding creative funding. But not only money, what do you need to make your project work that doesn't require money, but requires something that these other groups can give? I'm hearing some background noise, so I'm just waiting to see if the translator is off or something. Okay. So this collaborative funding is kind of an effort in cultural diplomacy. So you want to look at your partners and look at their funding history. What are their priorities? Are there overlapping goals that maybe you don't need to have separate projects? Maybe you can combine your projects. You can offer to help and assist with their project, and then they'll do the same for yours. Or maybe you can create one project out of your goals. I often will sit on boards or come to meetings, provide free trainings, consultations on many different community agencies, just so I know what they're all doing. And by now, after 20 years, everybody knows me anyway, but it took a long time for me to really understand the entire community and what everyone's doing out in these rural areas and how can we work together. I work a lot with small businesses, little restaurants, little stores, donating school supplies, donating food, pizzas. Anytime a business donates something, I give them a certificate to hang on their wall that says, I'm doing my part to prevent child abuse in our community. So everyone who comes to that business asks about it, and then they can talk about child abuse. And so it gets everyone sort of on board, even if they just donated some movie tickets, they are participating in our project. So the more you can reach out across disciplines, the more likely you are to find funding, either money or other things. So interdisciplinary projects are much more likely to get funding than one group working alone. The other thing that I consider funding in my career is student labor. I could not have gotten how far I have so far without students, hundreds of students. So we give students course credit towards graduation for their work on all of our projects. So we have classes like independent study, field study, research, and they get credit for that because you have to give them something for free labor, but they can do pretty much every phase of the project. They can participate in it, and they love it because it's real world experience that they can then enhance their resume with. They can maybe network and find a job through some of these partners in the future. So using student labor as much as you can really saves a lot of money. The other thing is to use the testimonials from the groups you're working with on your website, your materials, because their voices give legitimacy to what you're doing. In terms of the funding, you have to be totally transparent. You have to make it clear that nothing you do will ever be corrupt and everything will be spent according to the budget that you agreed upon. Once something goes corrupt, all trust is out the window. Okay, so now you've consulted the community, you've developed this collaborative project, you've created partnerships across disciplines, you've found some funding of money or other types of funding, you've involved your students, you have your action plan, you've implemented your program, and now you're going to need to evaluate whether it was effective or not. So there are two types of evaluations that you'll want to think about. The first type of evaluation is called formative, and this is when the program is first starting. You want to make sure it's implemented correctly. So you're looking at all of the aspects of the project and how did they work? And do we need to change anything? One big thing that happens in my research is people quit. They stop coming, maybe they move away, they die, they don't want to participate, but you don't know why. So analyzing, are there changes in the protocol? How complete are the data? I know in one of mine, a whole site of our evaluation of 300 parents, they did not photocopy page 4 of the survey. So we had a whole page of data missing for a large part of our sample. Why did that happen? So during the formative evaluation, you're figuring out, did people stick to the methodology? You're figuring out, did the participants finish everything? And if not, why? What part of the program worked and for whom? So in one of our studies, we found that the Spanish-speaking parents actually benefited from the program a lot more than the English-speaking parents, and this was in the US. So we had to figure out, why was that? And so we started videotaping them, and we saw that they had a great rapport and friendship with the parents. And so the white facilitators were much more business-like with the parents. So it was more like, I'm an expert teaching you something. So we had the Spanish-speaking teachers then train all the other facilitators on how to build that close relationship with the parents. So these formative evaluations help you improve your project before you do the whole project out in the biggest form that it will take. So you're usually using some kind of qualitative data. Maybe you're videotaping things. Maybe you're doing some kind of survey, how do people like being in the project? We ask parents all the time, what did you like about the project? And they love it. They want to come back. It's so fun. And so you are probably maybe keeping track of percentages of people who come and what percentage of things were completed, maybe doing some focus groups. So the formative evaluation is usually going to be qualitative data. At the end of your project, you're going to do the second type of evaluation, which is a summative evaluation. So here you're trying to figure out, did your program actually meet its goals? Remember in the beginning, I told you to make a plan for what if it doesn't work out the way we planned? What if nothing works? What if none of your goals were met? What is the next step? So you discover whether you met your goals. And this can help improve the program in the future, but that's not the main goal of the summative evaluation. The summative evaluations are usually going to be using quantitative data. So you're going to be using a lot of statistics. You might be using government statistics. Like in my case, we might be using official reports of child abuse. You might be looking at Google Maps if you're looking at things with geography or with infrastructure or water or things like that, land use. So you might be using official data, and you're probably using some questionnaires, rating forms, what have you, and then you're using statistics to analyze. So the best projects combine qualitative and quantitative data, and they're both very helpful, but for different reasons. A lot of times journals, when we're trying to publish, or our supervisors at the university, when we're trying to get a promotion, they require these summative type of evaluations. But for us on the ground, working with real people, we often care more about the formative evaluation. That's often more meaningful to us. It's like fills our heart, with our community that we're interacting with. So these are some ideas of how to get out there from the thought process all the way to the evaluation process. And hopefully you got something valuable out of that. And I would be happy to answer any questions or address your comments now. That's a picture of rural Colombia that I thought was appropriate to include. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you, Tasha. I'm going to help you in this activity with the questions. There was a question in English from Carolina Cardona. She was saying, we have something similar down here called pedagogical and productive projects, especially focused on coffee region of Colombia. These kind of activities are addressed and managed by private entities in order to improve the productivity of special regions like the coffee one, but giving the community the opportunity to get access to a personal career through the access to the universities. But my question is about the way that we have to take to start working with the community, since the university, specifically talking about the administrative staff or something similar.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Give me a minute.
There might be a question in there about how do you get your administration on board? I mean, I'm not part of your university, so I can't tell you about your own administration. I wouldn't know.
And we're going to give Carolina. Carolina, está por aquí. Carolina, ¿nos escuchas? Vamos a abrirte la oportunidad de prender tu micrófono para que nos puedas comentar un poco más de tu pregunta y aclararla, porque Tasha no entiende muy bien cuál es la pregunta. Entonces, te voy a dar la oportunidad que puedas abrir tu micrófono, ¿vale? She's going to clarify us her question, and so maybe you can switch to the translation channel, because she probably is going to talk in Spanish.
Can you hear me right now?
Sí.
Okay,
puedes
thank
hablar
you.
en inglés, en español, como tú quieras.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try to speak in English.
Vale, perfecto.
Okay, thank you, Tasha, for your speech. Pretty awesome. Okay, my question is about the way that we have to take to start working with the community. What we have to do from the university. I mean.
You mean what's the first step?
Yeah, something like that.
Well, I can't answer that for you because I don't know you, your university, or the community, but whatever community you're working with, you need to involve the elders or the leaders, whether it's religious leaders or cultural leaders or tribal elders, because you're not going to get anywhere without that. And so, I mean, in my case, it took many years. I moved to the community 20 years ago, and it probably took me 5 years for people to know me and trust me. But I started by just going to meetings of every single agency. And I just started getting to know people and helping them, offering free training, offering to come and consult on projects. So I did a lot of free work. And I involved my students in a lot of free work. And then it just built over time. But not knowing your context, I can't really answer that for you.
Okay, now I was trying to get, this information, because it's really interesting to try to figure out the way to work with the community. So thank you for your answer.
Tasha, we have a question in Spanish, so I'm going to say it in Spanish and you can switch to the translation channel. Tenemos ahora una pregunta hecha por Jenny Fuentes. Ella nos pregunta, para la publicación de las investigaciones con comunidades rurales, ¿qué estrategias se deben emplear?
It's the same strategy as any other research. I mean, you have to determine what your goals are. I mean, if you need to publish quantitative data for your promotion, then that's the type of data you have to collect. But as I mentioned, qualitative and quantitative together always make the best projects because you can really learn the nuances with the qualitative data, even if you can't publish that. So like in the US, we have academic freedom where we don't need to get permission on what to do research on. But if you need permission from your dean or your administration, then you have to design the project from that perspective.
Vale, perfecto, muchas gracias. Entonces, le damos ahora la oportunidad a que nos envíen las últimas preguntas. Vamos ahorita a iniciar la segunda actividad de esta jornada de hoy para el tour de la transferencia social. Entonces, pues es la última oportunidad para que le puedan preguntar a Tasha alguna otra cuestión frente a la charla que nos acaba de exponer. ¿Vale? Tasha, I believe that there's no more questions. So, and yeah, I was going to say that if you could put your email if they can contact you. Tasha les acaba de compartir el correo de ella a través de los que estamos acá en Zoom para que le pueden enviar algún mensaje si necesitan alguna otra pregunta o resolver alguna duda que de pronto les aparezca después de que haya pasado esta sesión. Ahí le pueden escribir para que ella pueda ayudarles en lo posible, ¿vale? Teniendo en cuenta pues que no tenemos más preguntas, vamos a pasar entonces a la siguiente actividad. Yo les voy a compartir acá en el chat el enlace para nuestra siguiente actividad para que nos acompañen. Vamos a tener unos proyectos que nos presentan desde la universidad, desde UDCA, para que veamos cómo hay unos proyectos ya avanzados en comunidades indígenas que la profesora Tasha, la doctora Tasha va a estar revisando para que hagamos una retroalimentación de estas experiencias y con eso pues haya como una oportunidad de tener una conversación fluida entre los investigadores y nuestra experta, ¿vale? Aquí en el chat les estoy dejando el enlace de Zoom para que se conecten a esta segunda actividad. Tan pronto yo le pongo ahorita a finalizar a esta, ingresaremos a esa sala, ¿vale? Muchas gracias nuevamente a todos, gracias a quienes se conectaron a través de YouTube. And thank you, Tasha, once again for your lecture that was very interesting for all of us.
Muchas gracias. Adiós.
Yes.